I taking this one? Right in the light. I'm going to step back. Hi, everybody. Good evening. First, we're going to start that over because I don't know what time it is. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the American Jewish Historical Society. I'm Gemma Birnbaum, the Executive Director, and we are honored to be hosting this book talk event, The Civil War Diary of Emma Mordecai, co-sponsored by the museum at Eldridge Street. In addition to those joining us in person, the program is being live streamed to over 650 people across the country, and thank you to all who have chosen to spend their evening with us. AJHS is the oldest cultural archive in the United States with over 30 million documents, books, art, and artifacts that reflect the history of the Jewish presence in the U.S. from 1654 to the present. And we invite you to visit us either in person at our home at the Center for Jewish History near Union Square in New York City or online at ajhs.org. Our conversation this evening will feature co-editor and professor of history and director of women's and gender studies at Rowan University, Melissa Clapper, and our moderator, president of Gratz College, Zev Elef. We would like to honor the other editor of this book, Diane Ashton, who was professor emeritus of philosophy and world religions at Rowan University. Diane passed away in 2022. She's an incredible historian, an incredible friend to AJHS, editor of our American Jewish History Journal for many years, and she is greatly missed. And so tonight we can celebrate her work in kind of a different way. This evening's conversation will also include a brief Q&A near the end of the discussion, so please write down any questions you wish to ask our guests on the note cards that you received at check-in. You will then be prompted when it is time to hand off your questions to an AJHS staff member who will collect them and deliver them here to Zev on the stage. Please raise your hand and a staff member will come bring you a note card if you don't have one and you'd like to ask a question. After the discussion, please join us for refreshments and a book signing in the Great Hall. And now please welcome co-editor Melissa R. Clapper and moderator Zev Elef.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. So we're here to talk about the Civil War Diary of Emma Mordecai, and something that I learned when working on this book is that the family at some point changed the pronunciation of its name from what we might assume a Hebrew pronunciation of Mordecai to Mordecai. So there you have it, something I learned immediately upon embarking upon this project. And before Zev and I get into the content of the book, I do want to talk a little bit more about our late colleague, Diane Ashton. Diane Ashton was a pioneering feminist religious studies scholar. She was a longtime professor at Rowan University. It is something of a coincidence that I ended up at the same institution she was at. She was there a lot longer than I was, and actually, neither of us were hired to teach Jewish studies per se, even though that's what our research interests were. I first met her when I was in graduate school, and she was such a warm presence. She was so interested in graduate students and in junior scholars who are coming up through the ranks, and she was just really a help to me and a mentor. And then once I went to Rowan in a different department, she was just a font of information and good advice and general resources. And gradually, we became colleagues rather than mentor and mentee, and we kept track a little bit of what we were working on. We read things for each other. We had lots and lots of conversations about American Jewish women's history. So I knew that she was working on this book about the Civil War Diary of Emma Mordecai, and she worked on it for a long time. And when she passed away in January of 2022, it really bothered me, the idea that this book she had worked on for so long would disappear into the ether. And that's the point at which I spoke to her husband, Richard Drucker, about it, and long story short, we agreed that I would complete the project and see it through to publication. In the last couple of years before she passed away, though, Diane had actually put this book a little bit on the back burner because she was involved with other projects, including one that Zev's going to tell us maybe a little bit about, a digitization project with Gratz College. So why don't you talk about that briefly and your relationship with
the American Jewish Historical Society.
Yes.
So Diane was very, very special. Really was. When I came to Gratz, immediately we thought we were going to digitize the Rebecca Gratz letters. She was Diane was the biographer of Rebecca Gratz, and it told more of a story than just Gratz. It was really about rediscovering women, and Jewish women, and philanthropists in the 19th century, their voices in particular. And to scan, and with the Historical Society is one of our key partners, we scanned about 900 of those letters. Diane was directing the project. Richard, we'll talk about in a little bit as well, supported the project throughout, and that was a lasting testament. Just a tremendous loss for all of us in our community.
And so I want to say Diane's husband, Richard Drucker, was an important partner in this project. I would not have been able to complete this book and see it through to publication without him. He hand-delivered grocery bag after grocery bag and box after box of books from her personal library that were really useful to me. I made him take them all back, though, because we didn't have the space eventually. And he was just really, an important partner in this. And I'm sorry to say that Richard passed away himself a couple of weeks ago, but I know he was really, really so happy to see this book out there in the world. And it was, just an honor to be part of it for them and to have this book be available as, a lasting legacy for both Diane Ashton and Richard Drucker. So who was Emma Mordecai? This is the only extant known picture of Emma Mordecai. You might be able to see why we did not choose to put her on the cover, but this is a very standard 1850s type of photograph, very posed. She's in a studio. She's leaning on a fringed piece of furniture. This, in the 1850s, when this photo was taken, only people with a certain amount of wealth would have been able to get their picture taken, so it's lucky that we have it at all. And in fact, the Mordecai family was fairly wealthy. I'll talk a little bit more about the family in a moment. But Emma was, like Rebecca Gratz, an important figure in the American Jewish community in the antebellum period. Rebecca Gratz in Philadelphia had founded the Hebrew Sunday School Society, the first network, really, or what grew to be a network of religious schools for Jewish children throughout the United States. And Emma, following in her footsteps, and certainly she knew Rebecca Gratz, they had relatives in common. One of Emma's brothers married one of Rebecca Gratz's nieces. They all knew each other. And she followed in her footsteps and founded the first Jewish Sunday school in Richmond, Virginia, which is where Emma lived most of her life, and many other Mordecai relatives lived there as well. And Emma also wrote a Jewish textbook for these schools. In the antebellum period in particular, there was very little literature available for this new network of Jewish schools. And in fact, in the earliest days, some of the early teachers in the 1830s and 1840s would use Protestant catechisms with all the references to Jesus and Christ blacked out. And so having books like this that Emma wrote was really important. And the fact that she was an author remained important to her throughout her life. So Emma was from this very large family. Here's a portrait of her father, Jacob. Jacob Mordecai was actually born in the United States. Emma was somewhat unusual, not entirely unique, but somewhat unusual in the early 19th century, before the Civil War, in that she and her parents, and some of her grandparents even, were born in the United States, or actually in the British colonies before they became the United States. On one side, her father, Jacob's father, Moses, came from England. He and his wife came from England. And on the other side, her mother, Rebecca Myers Mordecai, was actually the daughter of an extremely well-known Jewish silversmith named Meyer Myers, who lived in New York. Some of you may have seen his beautiful Judaica. Actually, there's still many pieces of his out there in the world that you can look at and admire. And so she was something of American Jewish royalty just because her family had been in the United States for longer than many other American Jewish families. Just for some context, at the start of the Civil War, there were something like 150,000 American Jews, something like that. These numbers are always debatable. Of that 150,000, approximately 25,000 lived in the South, and that included Emma's family. Jacob and his first wife, Judith, and then his second wife, Rebecca. Judith and Rebecca, or Becky, were actually sisters. I won't spend too much time on that now. That's not uncommon at all in this period. So Jacob ended up having 13 children, 6 with his first wife, Judith, and then 7 with his second wife, Becky. Emma was the 12th of 13 children, so very much on the younger end of the family. And Jacob lived in the South. He left Philadelphia pretty early in his first marriage and spent the rest of his life in either North Carolina or Virginia. The family became pretty well known because in Warrenton, North Carolina, they opened a boarding school for young ladies that young women from all over the South, not Jewish women, young women from all over the South would go to for a year or two for a certain kind of education and finish. And the school that they ran was known for being particularly academically rigorous at a time when young ladies' schools were sometimes more about French and learning ornamental skills like music or dancing or painting on china. And at the Warrenton Female Academy, you actually learned academic subjects, and the whole family was involved. Not only Jacob and his wife were teachers, but also some of the older siblings were teachers as well. Emma herself never taught at that school. She was too young. And when she was pretty young, the family sold the school and moved to a farm near Richmond, Virginia, and then eventually moved into Richmond. So Emma spent really the majority of her life, certainly through the period covered by the diary, living in Richmond or in the immediate environs. Now, I'm not going to talk about all the siblings. That's impossible. But I do want to mention one of the siblings, Alfred Mordecai, Emma's older brother. He's an interesting character because he is the only one of the surviving Mordecai siblings still alive at the time of the Civil War who did not live in the South. In fact, he was a career Army officer. He had gone to West Point. He was a career officer. He lived in New York. He was married to, as I said, one of Rebecca Gratz's nieces from Philadelphia. So their family, their immediate family, was quite different than many of the other Mordecais. For this and another reason I'll get to in a moment. And when the Civil War broke out, all of the Mordecai siblings who lived in the South just assumed that Alfred, like Robert E. Lee and many other generals who had been in the US military, would resign their commissions, come to the South, and run the Confederate Army. And Alfred did not do that. He didn't want to fight with, he didn't want to fight with relatives on both sides potentially. He didn't want to fight against career officers that he had been close to for all those years. He resigned his commission and spent the war in Philadelphia. And the family members in the South were very angry at him. And they actually had almost no communication during the war, which would have been a challenge anyway in wartime. And they were very upset at him. He wrote a 17-page letter to explain his decision, and they didn't accept it, and it was a big rift in the family for a long time. Something else that was different about Alfred is just to put the family in context, is that Alfred married a Jewish woman. A really surprising number of Emma's siblings either converted to Christianity themselves or married non-Jewish partners and raised non-Jewish children. That wasn't unheard of in the antebellum period, but it wasn't all that common either. And so that's another way in which the Mordecai family distinguished itself, if you'd like to call it that, during this period. Okay, just to give you a visual, on the left, we have the first page of Emma Mordecai's diary, the subject of this book. She started writing it in April of 1864 and continued to write the diary for just over a year until May of 1865. And what was the impetus for her to write this diary? It was that she left Richmond. She had spent most of the war there. Richmond was the capital of the Confederacy, and Emma knew all the elites. She was from an elite family. She hobnobbed with all the generals and their families, all the people pouring into Richmond as the Confederate capital. But it was becoming too dangerous. Richmond had already been the target of various military campaigns. It seemed like that was probably going to happen again. Emma was a middle-aged woman at this point, and she and her two older siblings, who had been living all together in Richmond with their mother, Becky, who had recently died at 90-something, which was quite an accomplishment for a 19th century woman who had had 7 children. So they decided they needed to get out of Richmond. And so in April of 1864, they rented out their home, and all the siblings went different places. Emma went to live at her sister-in-law's farm, Rosewood, about 5 miles outside of Richmond. So she did not go very far. And she went to live in a very familiar environment. Her sister-in-law, Rosina, not a Jewish woman, had been married to Emma's closest brother, Augustus, who had died about 18 years prior to this. And so she knew where she was going. She knew everybody there. She had 3 nephews, all in the Confederate Army, and a niece. And she also knew all the enslaved people who lived at Rosewood. And this was a very familiar space for her, but something about making this big change from being the mistress of her own household and living with her siblings and going to a new place to live is what caused her to start writing this diary. And what you see here on the left is actually a copy of the diary that Emma made herself in 1886. She seems to have gone back to her own diary to reread it and then discovered that the pages were torn, mice and bugs had gotten into them, and some of the pages were completely lost. And so in 1886, she copied out the whole thing again in her beautiful handwriting, adding some notes about what happened to people later, which are kind of fun. In one case, she wrote that the original diary entry said, oh, we all laughed most immoderately at a joke. And then in 1886, in parentheses, she wrote, wish I had written down the joke. It must have been funny, something like that. So she recopied the diary, and that's what we're looking at. That's what survives in the archive. And then she also pasted in a few other things, like this other document on the right is just a pass that a general gave after the fall of Richmond so that Emma could get in and out of the city. And then here's the last page of the diary. It's probably a little hard to read, but at the bottom of that it says, copied in Richmond, 1886. So she made it clear that this was a copy. It's in a basic brown kind of notebook that still is at the archives at the University of North Carolina's Southern Historical Collection. And then this is a picture of Emma's tombstone. She is buried in the Jewish cemetery at Richmond, along with a number of her relatives, but not all of them, because so many of her relatives were no longer Jewish and were therefore not buried in the Jewish cemetery. So we just wanted to give you some visuals to look at to kind of make sense of this. And in our conversations, Ev and I will now move to talking more about the contents of the diary. But it is worth noting that it was important to Emma. She kept it. She didn't throw it away. She kept it. She did move around a bit in the immediate aftermath of the war. I looked her up in census records and found her, in some of the years, 1870, 1880, 1890. I found her in some years. She was teaching. She became a teacher. And she lived in Georgia for some period. She lived in North Carolina for some period. But she seems to always have gone back to Richmond. And at the time of her passing away in 1906, this was a woman born in 1812, so she basically lived for the whole 19th century, excuse me. And when she died, she was eulogized, or there was an obituary in the American Jewish Yearbook that referred to her as an author. So she wasn't forgotten, even all those many years after her initial, work as an educator and as an author long before the Civil War. Her name still mattered. She was still a presence in the American Jewish community. Her passing was noted. And she kept this diary with her. She handed it down to a great niece of hers named Patty Mordecai. And the entire Mordecai family, it's a huge clan with relatives all over the South. And they eventually gave just enormous numbers of documents to the Southern Historical Collection at the University of North Carolina. They gave batches of papers at a few different times. And that's how this diary ended up there in North Carolina. And it demonstrates that Emma thought that it was important. It was something she not only hung on to, but then recopied because she thought it was important. Her family members thought it was important. The archive certainly thought it was important. And part of the legacy of the whole family is that there's just this enormous collection of papers that tell a story about a really interesting antebellum Jewish family. And Emma is, I would argue, one of the more interesting characters in that family.
Wow. So, and to draw on a term that Diane had used, but certainly that's something that, as you very, very ably completed this important project, this diary is an object. It could be understood, and it is to be understood, as a Jewish object, a race and a class object, a Civil War object, and a gendered object as well. That's what I want to talk to you about. I want to look at these lenses to understand this book. And first is a Jewish object. There really, especially as she moves away from that great citadel of Jewish life, Richmond, Virginia, and 4 miles down the road, her diary becomes her Judaism in many ways, doesn't it?
Yes, something that Diane noted in the unfinished draft of the book she had left behind when she passed away was that this book, the diary, is full of references to Judaism and to God. There's so many references to God. Emma writes prayers. She was, a pretty traditionally observant person, and she had to give some of that up during the exigencies of war. It's certainly clear from the diary, for instance, that she's not keeping kosher in this non-Jewish home. It's basically an impossible task. But Judaism remained incredibly important to her. She marked all the Jewish holidays in this diary. And every Shabbat, every Jewish Sabbath, on almost every Friday night and Saturday morning, she wrote in her diary that she read from her prayer book, and on Saturday morning she would read from the portion of the Torah that would be read in synagogues if she were at a synagogue, and so she would read that herself from her Hebrew Bible that she had with her, that she had brought with her. So Diane argued that the diary actually became her Jewish space. This was the place in a non-Jewish household where she was Jewish, where she expressed her Jewishness. It was the Jewish object that mattered to her. And she expressed this in many different ways in the diary. And something that Diane noticed, which was just fascinating to me to read, was that Emma spent most of the Jewish holidays during the year or so that this diary covers back in Richmond. She moved to Rosewood in April of 1864, and within a week was back in Richmond to stay there for all of Passover with Jewish relatives. She spent Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, there, and then went back to spend the whole prolonged holiday period after that between Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and Sukkot, Tabernacles. She was in Richmond again for close to 2 weeks. The only holiday she missed was Shavuot, Pentecost, in May, and she actually wrote in the diary that she was really upset at herself. She hadn't looked at her Hebrew calendar in time, and she didn't realize that she actually should be in Richmond. Every time she went to Richmond for the Jewish holidays, except with one possible exception, she did not take the diary with her. She didn't need it there because there is where her Jewish life was. There were actually 2 synagogues in Richmond. Her family went to a particular one. And it was actually the 6th largest Jewish community for part of the 19th century. So in fact, it was a citadel of American Judaism compared to some other places that her relatives lived. And this diary became her Judaism. It became her Jewish object. And so it was really fascinating to see that, and that's a pattern that Diane Ashton noticed when she was reading this. She was very attuned to the way that religion operated in somebody's daily life. And so she noticed, there's these gaps during the holidays. So Emma would say, oh, I'm about to set off for Richmond, and then, 10 days would go by, and then she'd start writing again and say, just spent the past 10 days of the holiday season in Richmond, attended synagogue, spent time with my family, enjoyed, Shabbat, Sabbath, and holiday meals. And so there's this really interesting way in which the diary became the vehicle for her Jewish expression while she was living in a non-Jewish household.
And I think it's a theme. I mean, Gemma had rightfully boasted that the society has records of American Jewish life from 1654 until the present, and that's true. But think about it. 1654, 23 Jews disembarked from the St. Catherine. We know that story quite well. But they don't have a synagogue until, with apologies to Sheretz Israel, 1729. For nearly 100 years. Jews had, and the Jewish community did grow in other places. You mentioned Philadelphia, Savannah, Charleston, Newport. It took a long time to create permanent Jewish spaces, and so the Mordecai family knew probably better than most that Jewish space didn't have to be particularly a citadel, had to be a synagogue. And many times it was retreating into the world of letters, of writing things down, of understanding heirlooms, whether it be a spice box, or we would call it a Havdalah set, or anything like that. And we see that a lot during the Civil War, not a lot, but we see it in a number of instances for Jews in the Civil War. When Jewish life was disrupted, we see that Emma Mordecai and others managed to rescue themselves through their own diaries. And the fact that she not only procured it, not only the fact that she maintained it and rewrote it, and then made sure that it was passed down, shows just how important the diary was.
Yeah. And it also shows, I think, the fact that she spent so much time with these relatives, even after leaving Richmond, shows the importance of those familial ties to maintaining American Judaism. A lot of these 19th century antebellum American Jewish families, they're all related to each other. They're all cousins. There's a lot of, a marriage within these various families. There's a network there, an important Jewish network. And that could be a business network, and it could also be a family network. And if those things, of course, were, often the same. And so she didn't, she had to make this move, but she didn't go to live with the non-Jewish niece that one of her brothers went to live with, and she didn't go to live further away, and she didn't go to live on the plantation of her older half-brother George, who had also converted to Christianity. She didn't do that. She stayed close enough to be close to the Jewish community, even though she had other options. So there's more than one reason for that, but definitely being close to Judaism and being close to some sense of Jewish life was an important factor in her decision to go to this particular sister-in-law.
So I want to talk about this as an object of race and class. You had alluded to it, that she was from a family of stature. That's how we even have at least one portrait of her. And in other spaces, you mentioned plantation, you mentioned enslaved people. This is a book this is a diary and her notes in a perspective that offers something important, Jewish or otherwise, about where she stood in an important moment in American history.
So Emma is an interesting, sort of contradictory, messy figure. On the one hand, she's this stalwart defender of Judaism. She starts a Jewish school. She writes a Jewish textbook. She fended off many attempts by some of her closest relatives, including numbers of her siblings, to convert to her. And she wrote, in her diary, she's very clear in lots of letters. She was Jewish. She was staying Jewish. She believed in Judaism. Leave her alone. She really is a very stalwart defender of Judaism. But she is also a product of her time in other ways, and she is a white person in the South, a person of means. And although it was never true that most white people in the antebellum South owned slaves, it was true that most white people of any means did purchase enslaved people as soon as they were able to, and that included the Mordecai family. When Jacob Mordecai first moved to the South, he actually was a complete failure as a business person again and again and again. The family did not succeed economically really until they opened this school in Warrenton, North Carolina. And from that point on, though, they were financially secure and economically successful. And from that point on, almost immediately, first they hired enslaved people, and then they bought enslaved people. And then the siblings, all the various siblings who, except for Alfred, who went north, they all owned enslaved people at some point or another. In Richmond, Emma owned a number of enslaved people who didn't really live in the household with her, not that many. She hired them out, which was typical for urban slaves, so that the wages would have been paid to her, but she then paid for the food and the clothing and the shelter and sort of an allowance to the enslaved people that she owned. And when she went to live at Rosewood, all those enslaved people who were hers, so to speak, they stayed in Richmond. She went back sometimes to see them. We'll maybe get to that in a moment. But she went to live at Rosewood, where Rosina was the mistress of a household that also, a farm household, that also owned a number of enslaved people. And what's interesting is that Emma and Rosina both clearly saw themselves as benevolent slave owners. They genuinely believed, because they were racist, which is not surprising given the time period and their place, they genuinely believed that the system of slavery was beneficent, not just for them as slave owners, but also for African Americans who were too, I'm going to put this in quotes, feeble-minded and other terrible things to run their own lives. Okay, these are, I'm not promoting or support, defending these attitudes in any way, but it's just part of the upbringing in the period that they lived in. However, Rosina basically had several generations of the same enslaved family living at Rosewood. She had made a promise never to sell anybody and never to break up the family, and she did keep that promise, which enabled her to congratulate herself for being a beneficent slave owner. And that both Emma and Rosina also abhorred violence. They thought that was completely counterproductive. That was no way to treat somebody that you were responsible for. And so they also really, in that way also, they could congratulate themselves for being benevolent slave owners. And there's a lot of racism in the diary. Anytime Emma writes about African Americans, it is not positively, whether they are her own enslaved people, the people on the farm who Rosina owned, all of whom she knew quite well because she spent so much time there even before the diary, or the African American soldiers that she begins to encounter toward the end of the Civil War who are coming into Richmond. And the terms she uses, I'm not really going to repeat here, but they are in the book, are just racist. There's nothing else to say about it than that. And she's one of these messy historical figures who can, on the one hand, be sort of a Jewish hero for being such a proud supporter of Judaism, but at the same time, be very much a product of this environment. And I should say that whiteness is really important here because in the South, the major binary, what mattered most was whether you were white or black, basically, and Jews were typically seen as white. That's just in the South, though. In the North, white Jews were not always accepted as white. Not in the antebellum period, and certainly not afterwards once the period of mass migration begins. And so the Mordecai family really benefited, even though they were Jewish, they benefited from being seen pretty automatically as white, and that's a benefit that they ran with by becoming slave owners. So it is an important dynamic in the diary that needs to be confronted and dealt with.
And what about her political annotations? What about this? Because it's also a Civil War object.
Right. So there's no question. Emma and all of the siblings, except for Alfred, were staunch Confederates. They damned the Yankees to the left. They damned the Yankees to the right. They, were big supporters of the Confederate government. Rosina had 3 sons in the Confederate Army, and there were many other Mordecai relatives throughout the South who were in the Confederate Army. A couple of nephews and cousins were either wounded or killed in the Army. The family was very much affected by this. They also had some vague relatives who were in the Northern Army, in the Union Army, including Alfred's son, Alfred Jr. But they were very staunch Confederates. They thought it was terrible. They thought Abe Lincoln was the worst thing ever. There was a rumor going around, actually, at some point that Ulysses S. Grant had been killed, and they rejoiced. The whole family rejoiced. This is great, right? They lost their best general, only to find out that it was, fake news, so to speak. Actually, there's a kind of ironic aftermath to that, which is that when Lincoln was in fact assassinated, no one believed it. They're like, oh, we're not going to get burned again. We believed it when Ulysses S. Grant was supposedly killed, but he wasn't. So this can't be true. And it took them several days to accept, oh, actually it was true, which was then a cause for rejoicing. So this is a Confederate family. They believe in the South. They believed, they enjoyed the privileges that they had in the South as a wealthy white family. To Emma, the end of the Civil War was a tragedy. Now, she and Rosina accepted it. They didn't, they acknowledged immediately that they lost. Right? They were on the losing side. They acknowledged it right away. They made big changes right away. Rosina, the sister-in-law, immediately after the war, within a day, basically, of Robert E. Lee's surrender, actually went to Cyrus, who was the sort of enslaved man who was the patriarch of the family that she had owned until yesterday. And she immediately offered to pay them wages, and she just assumed they would stay. Why wouldn't they stay? They had comfortable lives. And in a material sense, she probably had taken care of this family relatively well. And, she just assumed, okay, we lost, you're free, we'll pay you, and, let's just go on as we were before, but now I'll be paying you wages. And Cyrus basically said, yeah, no, see ya. And he and his family were gone within a couple of weeks. As soon as he could figure out an escape plan or just somewhere else to go, he and all of the family members picked up and they left. And for Rosina and Emma, this was a shock. They just couldn't believe it. It's so ungrateful. We were going to pay them wages. Why would these people leave? It was really a shock. And you can see at the end of the diary that Emma is just beside herself. So she doesn't know what to do. Plus, she and Rosina now had to do much more housework than they had done in the past. Now, these were not women who just sat around doing nothing while the enslaved people did all the work. If you read the diary, just part of the daily thing, they're sewing, they're making rugs, they're making furniture, they're cooking, they're out with the enslaved people harvesting strawberries, they're milking the cows, they're, getting the eggs. They are not doing nothing. They did actually work side by side. As was the case on many farms with not very many enslaved people. Not so unusual. But now, with nobody else there, they had to do more, and especially the cooking and the laundry. These were the worst kinds of chores to have to do for themselves. And so it was a big change, for them, and they resented it. They really resented it. It did not make Emma any more positively inclined toward the Union, the North, the Yankees, the invading army, or the enslaved people who left. And she actually stopped writing the diary in May of 1865, just a few weeks after the war ended, as did many, many Confederate women diarists. It's a very common pattern. And scholars really think it's not only because they had less time, literally less time, because they had to do more, but also because it was so evident that a chapter had closed. This was going to be a new chapter of their lives, like it or not. And so they were done. They were done, and even some of them had kept diaries before the war and would then go back to it. For some of them, like for Emma, this was a diary meant to mark a particular moment in time. It was not a practice she had before, except for a few months much earlier in her life, or after, as far as we can tell. And so, like many other Confederate women, she understood that the diary could be a good historical document and a marker of this unusual, unique experience, but then it was over, and it was time to move on.
So we anticipated the last lens, which is this is a gendered object. As I think about it, going back to Diane Ashton, her dissertation was on Rebecca Gratz. The Gratz family were part of Mikveh Israel, Congregation Mikveh Israel, which wrote notices to the Continental Congress, really saw themselves as a patriotic institution in its moment. And Rebecca Gratz's legacy, I don't get any extra dollars for this, but being affiliated with Gratz College, is she stands apart from many other people, and particularly women, in American Jewish history. It's sad to say, but Diane's career was bookended by, and her entire work you mentioned as a major pioneering feminist scholar and historian, but thinking about this as a gendered object in comparison to Rebecca Gratz and Emma Mordecai, there's something to be said about how this book really does speak to womanhood in its moment.
Yes. There were, of course, men who kept diaries during the Civil War. It would be silly to say that none did, but it was an extremely widespread practice among women, and to a certain degree, even more among Confederate women than among Union women, because most of the battles and just the privations of war were more felt in the South. And this is not at all to deny that there were problems in the North, right? There were, but the fighting wasn't there. You know, if you lived in Maine, you didn't have to worry about soldiers tramping through and taking everything, leaving with your last horse, which is something that happened at Rosewood. Rosina's last horse was just, you know, soldiers took it. If you lived in the South, if you lived in the North, you could very well lose a family member, and I'm certainly not trying to minimize that, you know, that tragedy. But if you lived in the South, you were more likely to know even more people who just never came home from the war. More men were mobilized on a percentage basis in the South, and more people were wounded, and more were killed, percentage-wise, in the South. And so there was just almost no family in the Confederacy that was not directly affected in some way, including the Mordecays, as I said. And women, there was this kind of gendered response, and you really see this in the diary. The practice of keeping a diary was associated with women. It was a gendered practice, even though certainly many men engaged in it. That was true before the Civil War. There was a real interest in women doing a kind of spiritual accounting by keeping a diary. Sometimes they were written to be read by parents or by religious figures in authority positions. Sometimes they were more personal, as we might think of a diary now. And sometimes they were kept to keep a historical record, which is clearly the reason why so many women began to keep diaries during the Civil War who hadn't before and might not after. And so there is this gender dimension, and there's also a gender dimension in the contents of the diary, because in addition to the themes we've already discussed, there's a lot of discussion of food, for instance. You know, what are they eating? Now, because Emma and Rosina lived on a farm, they didn't go hungry during the war, but they were bored by the food that they ate. There was just limitations to what they could eat, what they could prepare. They especially complained about the coffee. And honestly, and if you read any wartime diary from basically any time in history, there's always complaints about the coffee, okay? You can't get a good substitute anywhere. Well, any point after people started drinking coffee, I should say, in the Western world. And so there's this discussion of food. Emma and Rosina go to visit hospitals. There were a number of hospitals in Richmond, which was a receiving station for the Confederate wounded because it was the capital of the Confederacy. And in fact, one of the hospitals they did not visit was being run at this very moment by another Jewish woman who kept a diary during the Civil War, Phoebe Gates Pember Levy. Who kept a diary. It's a little odd. They never mention each other. They must have known each other. It's almost impossible to imagine they wouldn't have crossed paths, but they don't talk about each other in each other's diaries. Emma and Rosina went to visit a number of hospitals, though. They brought some food. They would bring they would bring bandages, they would read to soldiers, they would write letters for them if they needed to, or if their hands had been amputated, which was quite common, unfortunately. They were acting as the so-called angels of the household, which was the stereotypical gendered expectation for women during the antebellum period. And they carried out all those tasks, both at home in their own domestic sphere, but also in the public arena. And so in those kinds of ways, Emma's diary is a very gendered object, because the fact that she was a woman had a big impact on how she spent her time. And even the fact that she spent a lot of that time outside in nature. She walked around the farm, she took a lot of walks, and when she did, she clearly knew a lot about botany, which was considered the feminine science during this period. She recognized plants. She talks a lot about arranging flowers, but she also she knew what she was looking at, and she would go on these long nature walks, basically, with her niece, with her niece Augusta, named after her late brother Augustus, and she spent a lot of time outdoors. And that too is a female thing to do in this period. And it was also considered a good activity for women who might not have to, for upper class women or middle class women who might not have as many domestic tasks to do in the home. And so there's all these ways in which gender shows up in this diary. And then there's the smaller little things that show up, like a lot of complaints about how old her dresses are and how everything needs to be fixed all the time and nobody's had a new hat throughout the whole war. Remember, there's a blockade in the South, and so there's a limited number of goods getting in. And so there's a gendered element in addition to a religious element that's really pervasive throughout this diary.
Wow. A reminder, like Gemma had said, we invite you to scribble, hopefully not just scribble, to write down your questions for Melissa to handle, and please do submit to an AJH staff member. I'm struck by, here is somebody who's writing a very private document, who is a very public person. She's a person of social stature. She's part of a large family. And in a very private document, she is writing about a large family. She herself is a very private person. She does not have an immediate family. She is very much unmoored. She's moving from location to location, even for the holidays. She's scampering back to Richmond. She's coming back. She's writing about society. And what do you make of that balance of, again, private document, private person, but very much answering to a lot of public, larger, multiple people issues?
I think, to me, this kind of diary is just a beautiful testament to how ordinary people, she's not totally ordinary in the sense that she's high class status and from this very prestigious family, but more or less regular people really, they value their own lives. Ordinary people's lives matter. I mean, this is my calling card as a historian, right? That we talk about ordinary people, not just the people who are the presidents and the generals and the like. And her life mattered to her. It was worth writing about. She also understood herself to be at a moment in history that people would want to know about. I mean, that is certainly true, and that's another reason why there are so many diaries around wars, okay, including Anne Frank's diary, actually, is another example of that. But her life mattered. It mattered to her, and she wanted to express that. She wanted to record it in some way. She didn't want to just let it go by. So she's, at the same time she's writing the diary, she and her family are exchanging, hundreds of letters throughout the war. So there's also a private correspondence and a really private set of expressions that they really were not writing for public consumption. But the diaries are a little bit, liminal. They are private, and certainly they weren't written for public consumption usually, unless later you're somebody like Winston Churchill who knew that people would read his diary. But they're also an I am here statement, or I was there, right? I was here, I was there, my voice matters. My experience matters. It's part of a larger tapestry, yes, but it's a thread that's beautiful and that matters to me. And I think, as somebody who's really interested in regular people's lives and in what we might think of as history from the bottom up, this kind of document is just so important for understanding the past, that we need to understand what individuals' experiences were like within this larger tapestry of history. And I think she really had a sense of that. She's a very educated woman, and she was very literate. She had this beautiful handwriting, and she understood herself to be an actor in history, I think, in some really interesting ways. So yes, it's a private document, and no, she did not necessarily expect that it would be public. Diane thought, and I agree, that she might have picked it up in 1886 with an eye to maybe publishing it, because that's a moment at which a number of Confederate women are publishing their diaries, so she might have considered making it a more public document in that way. But even if she didn't, it mattered to her that she was there. It's a statement, it's a testament, it's a statement of witness, and for women in particular, that's a really important thing to be able to do. And literate women were lucky to be able to do that in this way that could be preserved relatively easily.
Okay, some fabulous questions. First, why did Emma not marry? Did she write about her own sexuality or her ideas around children?
Okay, so Emma certainly did not write in this diary about sexuality, looking for that in a blatant way. You do see it in some 19th century writing, I should say, but not in this diary. Also, at the time the diary started, Emma's 51. Now, plenty of middle-aged people can get married and have sexual lives, but it wasn't what her focus was in her life at that moment. In an earlier period in her life, Emma actually had been engaged. Interestingly, considering how stalwart a defender of Judaism she was engaged to a non-Jewish man very briefly. Also, interestingly, her older brother George, her older half-brother George, put the kibosh on this relationship because he said their parents would be so heartbroken. George then himself converted to Christianity and married a non-Jewish woman, so not sure what to say about that. But Emma never seems to have had a long-term romantic or serious relationship again after that. There is some, I am not, the chronicler of the Mordecai family is actually Dr. Emily Bingham, who wrote a book called Mordecai, The American Family. And there's some little hint in that book, I think, that, that Emma was so distraught, that she was truly distraught over this broken engagement. And maybe there's even some intimation that she tried to kill herself, but there's very little documentation about that. So I'm mentioning it here for dramatic effect, but we actually don't know much about it. She does not seem to have expressed interest that often in her letters in having children, but she was very close to a lot of her nieces and her nephews. And that is evident in the diary. 2 nieces in particular are very present in her diary. Her niece Augusta, who lived at Rosewood and was about 17, and her niece Caroline, who stayed in Richmond, but actually had been living with Emma and her siblings until the household was broken up. Caroline stayed in Richmond with different cousins. They're very present in her life, and she loves Caroline and Augusta both like daughters. She refers to them as daughters a few times.
In that way, there's a symmetry between she and Rebecca Grass,
Absolutely.
who also gives very little insight into why she did not marry.
Right.
She had suitors, we know,
Right.
But also considered her nieces and her nephews to be like children.
Yes, and actually, so like Rebecca Gratz actively raised the children of one of her sisters who died, and actually Caroline, the niece in Richmond's mother, had also died. So, her name was Eliza, Emma's sister, and Emma clearly had a lot to do with raising her too. And so there is definitely a symmetry there. It was not so uncommon for, especially in large families, for a woman to not get married. Not all women got married in this period, but I can't comment. I mean, we don't know. I don't think there's any documentary record of whether that was a huge regret for her whole life. We just don't know that. Sometimes the record doesn't show things.
Do we know when she updated, this is another wonderful question, when she updates the journal and other writings, do we know if she's been impacted by the era of Reconstruction? Do we know if her views changed about race?
Okay, that's a great question. So she doesn't comment like that in the diary itself. There are she has parenthetical comments, like I mentioned about the joke, or in a couple of cases, so-and-so married so-and-so, or, this person got divorced, the scandal, in the 19th century. So she did comment a little bit. Diane corresponded with the United Daughters of the Confederacy to find out whether Emma had ever joined this group, and it seems that she did not. She's not on any of their membership lists. On the other hand, I found some evidence that Emma did make contributions, both financial and things like furniture, to a few Confederate museums in the late 19th century. We don't have a lot of evidence about whether her views on race changed. It's unlikely that they did a 180. That's probably not too likely. Reconstruction affected her in the sense that her family, she personally, and then a lot of the relatives lost wealth as in the outcome of the war, right? Because all the enslaved people they had owned, who had been the embodiment of their wealth, unfortunately, were no longer theirs. And we do know that although Emma had worked a little bit as a tutor, occasionally a private tutor going to visit people's homes before the war, after the war she does seem to have needed to work at least sometimes because, as I said, she became a teacher in other cities for periods of time. So in that sense, Reconstruction affected her because her financial situation deteriorated, but it didn't deteriorate all that much. And it doesn't seem like she worked for the next 50 years that she lived, or almost, that she lived after this. So sometimes the documentary record, we wish that we knew things and we just don't. I can't say whether her attitudes on race changed, but we do, in the book about the family, it seems pretty clear that in the family overall, they didn't change very much, at least for the couple of decades after the war.
This is a good question, knowing your scholarship much more broadly. Did she write about Europe? Did she also write about other groups like Native Americans? Okay,
so again, this diary only covers 14 months at the most in Emma's life. There are zillions, to be technical about it, of letters in the Mordecai family papers at the University of North Carolina, but I have not read them all. So I can't tell you if she ever wrote about them. There's no mention of Native Americans whatsoever in this diary. She does mention Europe a couple of times, mostly because she spent quite a bit of time during the year plus of this diary translating a play from the French. So Emma was literate in French, which was a very common, something very common for educated, wealthier women in this period. It's not so clear that she was educated in Hebrew, actually, that she was literate in Hebrew, even though her father, Jacob Mordecai, was known to be one of the most knowledgeable Jewish men in the whole antebellum South. When he died, he left a huge, huge library of Jewish books, 19 Jewish books. No one had ever seen that many Jewish books in Richmond, Virginia. So he was literate in Hebrew, but it's not actually clear whether Emma, despite her deep devotion to Judaism, was literate. The Bible that she read was almost certainly Isaac Leeser's translation of the Hebrew Bible that had come out before the war started. Almost certainly. And so, she writes about Europe in that sense. It's a place that culture comes from, and she translates this play. But to my knowledge, she never traveled there.
What about the Jewish infrastructure? Does she offer about welfare, benevolent societies? You pasted her against the backdrop of Rebecca Gratz, who of course founded nearly all of them. What about that broader Jewish community, synagogue being chief among them, but more broadly?
Right. Well, there were two synagogues in Richmond, one at least nominally Sephardic and one Ashkenazic. The Mordecai family went to the Sephardic one, but they also Emma clearly attended both, and she wrote at length actually about a sermon that I'm going to say rabbi, but he was not actually an ordained rabbi, which was very common in this period, as Zeb scholarship has shown us so well. There were really very few ordained rabbis in the U.S. before the Civil War, and none in Richmond. She wrote the lay leader. He's not a lay leader. What's the best word for this? He's the religious leader. He's the chazan. He's
a religious functionary.
He's a religious functionary at the Ashkenazic synagogue. Gave a sermon basically warding off potential accusations of anti-Semitism against the Jews in the South. And Emma did note that in her diary and write a little bit about that sermon. So she was well aware of what was going on at both synagogues, but her family went to the synagogue that had been Sephardic originally and still used the Sephardic ritual and the rites, although by this time, very few people in it were actually Sephardic. And she's definitely a pillar of the Jewish community in Richmond. Richmond had some of the same kinds of Jewish infrastructure as Philadelphia, but not as much. It is a smaller community. So they didn't have a Jewish orphanage, and they didn't have both a Jewish female sewing circle and also what was called a female Hebrew benevolent society. They had one group that functioned in both of those ways. She was certainly a member of it. I don't think I know whether she was a founder of it. I don't think so, but she certainly modeled herself after Rebecca Gratz, who was a generation or so older, and everybody knew who Rebecca Gratz was in the American Jewish community. So she modeled herself along that lines. And she was also, like Rebecca Gratz, involved in non-Jewish philanthropic endeavors in Richmond as well. Like I said, there was a lot of socializing across religious boundaries in Philadelphia, but also in Richmond.
So this diary is being first published in full, but it's been excerpted. Jacob Rader Marcus, the Dean of American Jewish Studies, and a number of different volumes excerpted from it, but it's never been published in full. There could be many reasons for that. One, that it paints a woman in a prominent Jewish family, writing about things that you've said. Some things you said, you very kindly said, go read the book. You don't need to enunciate them out loud. Was it challenging for you to write this book, to help not write, but help to edit and complete Diane's work? Certainly as a benefit for scholarship, but thinking about it, of what it does and elevates for the Jewish community at large, what do you think? Do you think that's only now why we're seeing this published?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the diary is known, right? Civil War scholars, for instance, know about this diary. It gets cited in the whole Mordecai family, actually. There's almost a whole chapter about them in a book that's about siblings. during the Civil War, particularly siblings on opposite sides in the war. She was witness basically to the fall and the burning and the devastation of Richmond at the very end of the war, and so those parts of her diary are cited frequently in books about Richmond and the South and the end of the war. So she wasn't totally unknown, and Diane actually had been writing about her for quite some time and published a couple of articles about her almost 10 years ago now. So people in the field knew that Diane was working on this project, certainly. But I think that Diane thought that it was really important to have the diary in full, because you can't get somebody's voice from just a couple of quotes here or there, and because the diary touches on so many different kinds of things, on daily life in the war, on what it was like to have close family members away in the army, of what it was like to have your farm continuously invaded by both Yankee and Union soldiers, and Confederate soldiers, of what it was like to be almost a refugee. A significant number, nearly 1 million people in the South had to leave their homes during the Civil War. And so that's another experience. So Emma actually says explicitly in her diary, she doesn't really consider herself a refugee in the same way because she was going somewhere familiar and close by, but she did move and leave. There's a lot of mobility, internal migration due to the conflict. And so I think Diane really believed that publishing this was first a few things. First of all, it's a reminder that there were Jews in the United States before 1880. There's this sort of temptation to think about American Jewish history as, well, maybe there were some people in 1654.
Well, as you pointed out, just so people have the numbers, about 150,000 Jews around the Civil War, 250 in 1880, 1 million by the turn of the century, and probably around 3, 4, 5 million when we get a couple decades in. So that the population, but good to have the context.
Yeah, but it doesn't, so it explodes, but there is a long-standing Jewish history. And that's also important because it means that there's a long-standing American history that needs to include Jews and Judaism, and it hasn't always. So that's another contribution just having a document like this makes. It also tells us something about women's experiences during the war, that no matter how many Confederate diaries you have, each one is different in some ways. And I think that was also important to Diane. And then it was part of Diane's career-long interest in thinking about women in Judaism. As I've already mentioned, Rebecca Gratz, but Diane also wrote a book about the history of Hanukkah in America that is very much about the way that women elevated, actually, and made Hanukkah the thing that it is now, which it wasn't before. And so this was a kind of career-long interest of Diane Ashton's, and she saw it being realized through the publication of this particular text. And I think, and for me personally, working on this, as someone who is not a Civil War historian and had to do some catch-up reading.
You did a very, very good job of...
I had to do some catch-up reading, and for me, another important thing that this shows us is just the messiness of history. People are complicated. The same person who is performing heroic acts of Jewish preservation, in one moment is also a racist slave owner. It's the same person. People are messy. History is complicated. We have to understand that nuance. And a document like this is a contribution to that kind of discussion. I think a lot of us, give grace to the people in our own lives for being complicated and messy, and historians do the same thing. We don't cover things up. We look to understand, how real people lived and understood the world around them. And this document, for me, that's one of its most important contributions. And publishing it in whole is a way to do that. And then I think there's also just the smaller, well, maybe it's not smaller, the idea that, Jews have been in America since the beginning, and their stories are both part of the larger stories of American history and also a really unique perspective on them, sort of side angle into some of them. And this diary does that too. And that's a really important thing to note, right? American history contains multitudes, and here's a piece of that.
And I think, with due credit, the self-confidence of both Diane and yourself to help share that story and understand the messiness. A generation or two ago, scholars would have said, this is not the Jewish side of things that needs to be revealed. Let's have more of Rebecca Gratz. That idea of embracing the messiness represents a certain critical self-confidence that creates a fullness that I think that Jewish lives, academic rigor, can be blended, and we should be able to tell everything all at once, despite, to use what you said, it can be incredibly messy. Yeah. That's really important. they're telling us that we have to say goodbye. Melissa, what you've done for Diane, for our friend, and for our community of scholars is really something to be cherished, something to be thanked. I want to thank everybody here and the American Jewish Historical Society for providing the space. It's a really terrific book, messy or not.
Thank you, everybody.